Not from the state, Your Honor. Not from the state, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor. No, Your
Dr. Cragen first. Is that right? Good. Let's have the
All rise for the jury.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll go back on the record in the matter of State of Utah versus Martin MacNeill. He is present with his counsel. The state's attorneys are present, and the jury is now seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The state may call its first witness.
State calls David Cragen.
Mr. Cragen, if you'll come up here to the clerk's desk, please raise your right hand and be sworn.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you shall give in the case now pending before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Thank you. If you'll be seated here and respond to counsel's questions.
Morning.
Good morning.
Almost said trick or treat. Will you state and spell your last name for the record?
Cragen, C-R-A-G-U-N.
And do you have a title associated with your name?
I'm a physician, so MD.
Dr. Cragen? How are you employed?
I'm an interventional cardiologist at Central Utah Clinic here in Provo, Utah.
And in order to be an interventional cardiologist, what kind of training, education, and experience do you have?
Undergraduate degree, followed by medical school for 4 years, followed by 3 years of internal medicine residency, 3 years of cardiology fellowship, and an additional year of interventional cardiology fellowship. So 15 years of post-high school training.
And a total of 7 years of training and education after medical school?
Correct.
And how long have you been practicing?
6 years.
Is this the kind of job a layperson may call a specialist?
Yes.
What does your practice include?
Management of clinical heart patients, from heart attacks to arrhythmias to heart failure to the full spectrum of cardiac disease.
Have you ever been sanctioned or disciplined by the Department of Professional Licensing or any other professional organization?
No.
And your expertise is in what specifically?
Clinical cardiology, and again, all manifestations of heart disease, and then specifically further training in interventional cardiology, which is placing stents and other devices in the heart to treat certain heart problems like heart attacks.
So are you what we might call a practitioner?
Yes.
Do you also do research?
Some limited clinical research.
But your expertise is in treating heart condition?
Treating and managing patients.
Did you review medical reports relating to the death of Michele MacNeill?
Yes.
What specifically did you review?
I had medical reports from Dr. Von Welch, from Dr. Thompson, I believe the emergency room doctor, the emergency room notes from nurses and others that were there, as well as the autopsy findings.
Okay, let me go through those a little bit. Dr. Welch had what specific reports? Do you remember?
He had a clinical visit note from late March of that year, and as well as the labs and EKG that were done as part of that, or as a continuation of that exam.
And for the benefit of the jury, what is an EKG?
An electrocardiogram is a tracing of heart activity, records the electrical activity of the heart over a 10-second period.
Were there also labs associated with Dr. Welch's report?
Yes.
You said reports from Dr. Thompson. What were those reports?
Notes from his, the ER visit, or sorry, is he the...
Dr. Thompson is a plastic surgeon.
Okay, sorry, yes, Dr. Thompson. I reviewed his notes related to the to his preoperative exam in the office, as well as the immediate exam done the day of surgery, as well as some of his follow-up notes.
Okay. And you said you reviewed emergency room?
Also emergency room physician and nursing reports.
This is from Dr. Van Wagner?
Correct, from American Fork Hospital.
And then also the medical examiner's report?
Yes.
Is it a common and accepted practice in your field to rely on the medical reports of other doctors in rendering an opinion?
Yes, every day I'm asked by other physicians with sometimes more, sometimes less history to make medical decisions and help guide therapy and treatment.
And so being an expert in interventional cardiology, people will call you and say, hey, here's the situation, here's what we know, and based on that you'll offer opinions.
Absolutely.
As a result of your experience and training, have you formed an opinion about the death of Michele MacNeill as it relates to heart conditions?
Yes.
What did you do in terms of methodology in order to form an opinion?
Again, primarily because I didn't have the patient to examine. It's primarily based on chart review, reviewing all the documents that we discussed, including the EKG, the labs, and the detailed reports by the various physicians.
And is this a common and accepted practice?
Yes.
Did you employ general cardiovascular knowledge or scientific principles in rendering your opinion?
Yes, we try to use the best evidence-based medicine based on the most recent journal articles and the current state of the science.
Did your training, both at medical school and your residency and in your fellowship, include education regarding the toxicological effects of drugs on the heart?
Yes.
Specifically, the drugs that were found in Michele MacNeill's system. Are you aware of those?
Yes.
And what effect those can have on the heart?
Yes.
Are the effects of these drugs on the heart what we might call common knowledge in the medical community?
Yes.
Is it a part of cardiology curriculum
Yes.
and toxicology? Did you take classes in toxicology?
Seminars more than classes. There's some toxicology during medical school.
Okay, so are there other ways in which you're familiar with the effects of these drugs on the heart?
Yes, we've had, through my training, we've had seminars and frequent discussions of them. This was, in particular, I did my cardiology fellowship training at the University of Arizona, and they have a national center there that specializes in the QT effects of drugs, and so we had local experts there that spoke to us regularly on this subject.
Are there risks associated with the use of the drugs that Michele MacNeill was found to have in her system on the heart?
Yes.
So how do we account for risks associated with those drugs?
I guess I'm not following.
Are there ways in which you can be more predictable, you can make better predictions on how a drug might affect a person's heart?
Well, I think the dose of medication that the patient takes affects it, and then the combination with other medications can be somewhat unpredictable because there's so many permutations and combinations that could occur. But
are you familiar with the term or diagnosis of myocarditis?
yes.
What is myocarditis?
Myocarditis is an inflammation of heart muscle. Usually, the most common cause in America is viral. So it's after a viral syndrome such as a mild cold or flu. The patient's heart can become inflamed, and as part of that inflammation, the heart can can become involved, and it can lead to heart failure, arrhythmias, chest pain, shortness of breath, those kinds of symptoms.
You said that a virus is the most common way that it's caused.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the term etiology?
Yes.
What does etiology mean?
Etiology is another term. It's a term that we use in medicine to say cause. So etiology would mean it's the cause of another disorder.
What are the other potential causes of myocarditis?
Metabolic, meaning there could be drugs that could cause the myocarditis. It can certainly happen due to ischemia alone, or meaning lack of oxygen, if you weren't breathing well or something for some time, but that would take some time to develop.
How is myocarditis diagnosed?
It's generally a clinical diagnosis, meaning that patients come in with the appropriate symptoms, and we review those symptoms, and through a process of elimination of other possibilities, we come to the conclusion that it's myocarditis. It's usually aided by imaging studies. We often would perform an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of the heart. We don't see a lot. Well, sometimes with myocarditis, you can see that the heart is weakened, which is a syndrome called cardiomyopathy, where the heart is actually weakened and not beating as forcefully as it would otherwise. Sometimes you'll see an effusion, which is a small collection of fluid around the heart as part of the inflammation. And then there are other tests, such as a cardiac MRI, which can be done, which is using an MRI machine to look specifically at the heart muscle, and there are certain patterns that can be picked up on a cardiac MRI if it's done that are consistent with myocarditis, and it can even help you narrow in as to which virus is the most likely virus to be the cause. And then the most definitive ways of diagnosing are biopsy, but that's rarely done nowadays because it's hard to do a heart biopsy, somewhat hard to do it. Two, because myocarditis can be patchy, meaning you can see it in some parts of the heart and not others, so a biopsy could miss it, so it has a low chance of picking up it. I guess those are the two main reasons we don't do it routinely. And then the final way of diagnosis is, of course, at autopsy.
Okay. But there are a lot of other ways to diagnose this outside of autopsy.
Yes, I diagnose lots of living patients with myocarditis.
Okay. You remarked on a number of things that you would use in diagnosing this, and I just want to make sure I understand those correctly. It sounds like you pointed out clinical history, lab values, and imaging, either EKG, echocardiogram, or this, I can't remember what,
Cardiac MRI.
MRI.
Mm-hmm.
What is the most common way of diagnosing myocarditis?
The most common would involve a patient having the appropriate clinical history. EKG may give us some insight into that. An echocardiogram would almost always be done if it's suspected, and sometimes, depending on the degree of symptoms, a heart catheterization or an angiogram might be done to exclude other possible causes.
Okay, so the first two you pointed out, it sounds like our clinical history is. Would it be fair to say symptoms?
Correct.
For that, and then imaging?
Yes.
So are there symptoms associated with myocarditis?
Yes, most patients with myocarditis are symptomatic. The most common symptoms are shortness of breath, chest pain. Often they can, if it leads to heart failure, they can have swelling in their ankles, difficulty breathing, being very short of breath. Those would be the most common symptoms.
When would they have difficulty breathing?
Usually several days after the onset of myocarditis, as if the myocarditis leads to a cardiomyopathy, the weakening of the heart muscle.
Okay. So we talked about your education, your experience, your consultation history, your use of medical histories, and your general knowledge of cardiovascular disease. Did you employ all of these things in rendering an opinion about Michele MacNeill's heart and its relation to her death?
Yes.
What are your opinions as it relates to Michele MacNeill's heart and her death?
Well, I was asked by a detective on the case to review the case and to review the autopsy findings. And the initial autopsy findings had found that she had died as a result of myocarditis, But on reviewing it, it was listed as a very mild case, histologically, meaning based on the slides that she reviewed. It was felt to be a mild myocarditis, and in my experience, patients with mild myocarditis have mild problems related to the myocarditis. They don't have serious arrhythmias and serious life-threatening complications from mild cases. Most mild cases don't rise to the level of medical detection, probably, but and that's because they have very few complications. So my feeling was that the degree of findings expressed by the initial pathologist on the case did not necessarily suggest that she should have had a lethal complication.
Okay. Now, you said you also do clinical review. Did you review Michele's clinical history as it was given to you?
I did, and there were very specific statements in Dr. Von Welch's history and physical that she had no chest pain, she had no shortness of breath, she did not have other symptoms related to that. There were notes in Dr. Thompson's chart that even on the day of her death, that neither, according to his notes, neither Dr. MacNeill nor his daughter, didn't specify which daughter he had spoken to, but neither of them had recognized any symptoms that were unusual, chest pain or shortness of breath and those things. So she had no symptoms to suggest that she had a significant myocarditis.
Based on the lack of symptoms, what is your opinion as it relates to a sudden cardiac death?
The lack of symptoms and the mild histology both suggest that her course would be benign generally, that the chance of a serious or life-threatening complication would be very rare.
You reviewed her blood work as well?
I did.
This was from her appointment with Dr. Welch in March of 2007?
Correct. I believe the appointment was on March 27th, and the blood work was a couple of days later on March 29th. But.
Okay. What is your opinion about the blood work?
The blood work looked very normal. She had very normal electrolytes and blood counts. And maybe one of the more telling numbers, though, was the BNP, which is it's a hormone made by the heart muscle. And generally, if there's a significant heart process going on, the BNP is elevated, and hers was in the low normal range.
So if someone were to have serious complications with myocarditis, you would expect that BNP, and I'm not going to repeat what that word is, but you would expect that BNP number to be a lot higher.
Correct. It most commonly would be, yes. Other lab work included at the time she presented to the American Fork Hospital under full arrest. She did have a troponin at that time, which is a protein made in heart muscle that's we only find in the bloodstream in appreciable quantities after somebody's had damage to the heart. That was mildly elevated at 0.22. That could go along with myocarditis, but in the setting of somebody who's been coded for a couple of hours, that would be the most likely cause, meaning her troponin was up, but actually her liver enzymes, which also reflect not getting enough oxygen, were much higher. So the degree of liver damage at that time was still higher than the degree of heart damage at the time of her death.
What does that mean?
Means, again, the troponin was mildly elevated. This is this protein that indicates some heart damage, but still in a range that would go along with very mild myocarditis, if at all, but more likely due to her long resuscitative efforts.
So is it fair to say that you're saying it's hard to extrapolate any specific finding in light of that?
Well, I think if myocarditis were the cause of her demise, I would have expected the troponin to be much higher.
Okay. You've talked about lab work and a lack of symptomology. In sum, what is your opinion as it relates to myocarditis?
I think the lack of symptomatology and the lab work that we have available make it very unlikely that her myocarditis was severe enough to present her a significant risk of cardiac death.
Did you also review EKGs?
I did.
Which EKGs did you review?
I had an EKG from late March 2007, and also there was a comparator from 2003.
What can you tell us about these EKGs and as it relates to her heart prior to her death?
Both EKGs looked quite normal. There were no changes that might suggest, on either EKG, there were no changes of any significance to suggest significant underlying coronary disease, myocarditis, or other heart disease.
Let's assume Michele MacNeill came into your office on March 29th of 2007, and you ran an EKG on her, and the result was the same as her EKG that was ran by Dr. Welch at that same time, and you have all of the training and experience you have now. Would you be concerned about her risk for a sudden arrhythmia?
No.
Why not?
Because she has very few predictors on that EKG of significant heart disease.
Are you familiar with the QTC figure or interval? Or?
Yes.
And what is that?
So the QT is the amount of time, and it was explained briefly yesterday, but it's the amount of time that it takes the heart to discharge and recharge with every heartbeat. With each heartbeat that we have, our heart discharges from top to bottom, and that's the Q part of it. And then the T is how long it takes to recharge and get ready for the next heartbeat. And it's something that we've been measuring as long as we've been doing EKGs, which is most of the last 100 years. That helps us understand how the heart's doing, if the heart's struggling, and how effectively it's recharging.
And I put a letter. I put a letter at the end of that acronym, QTC. What does the C stand for?
Yeah. So QT is the total amount of time it takes to recharge. The difficulty with interpreting that, though, is when your heart's going faster, the heart has to discharge and recharge faster. When that's going slower, it has to discharge and recharge slower. And so the C stands for corrected, meaning that we have a formula that we apply to the QT that corrects it for the heart rate and allows us to compare one EKG to another. Even if the patient's heart rate is 60 on one and 80 on another, we can compare the two because we can correct them with this formula.
Okay. What was Michele MacNeill's QTC in March?
In March, I believe it was 476.
I should have said of 2007.
Yes.
I'm assuming we're okay. How do you interpret that QTC?
That's mildly prolonged, meaning a little longer than the average female. We'd accept generally up to about 460 milliseconds for a female. So it's slightly prolonged, but not into what I would consider a clinically significant prolongation.
And this is because even though the percentages may, well, let me rephrase that. The risk may increase, but it's only minute until you get to a certain range?
Correct. It's a spectrum, so the higher your QTC, the higher the risk, and it probably increases somewhat exponentially at higher levels, but at this level it's a very minute risk.
At what range would you consider it to be clinically significant?
Most cardiologists start being much more concerned around 500 milliseconds.
What do you think about the process of using a single QTC reading to interpret that as this person having a longer interval?
I certainly don't do it in my practice. I think that each EKG is different. If I did an EKG on the same person a few minutes apart, the QTCs will be slightly different. There's a natural variation, just like our blood pressures are different. If we checked even in both arms at the same time, we'll come up with a couple of points difference just because partly the limitations of our testing and partly just normal physiology. But I think a single QTC is something like similar to taking a single temperature and assuming that that's always the patient's temperature. So QTCs vary from time to time. And in fact, as I mentioned, I reviewed her comparator EKG from 2003, at which time her QTC was 426. So her QTC, which was an entirely normal value. So her QTC has varied somewhat. Some of that may be because of hypertensive heart disease, and things had changed in those 5 years, and some of it may be the natural variation in testing.
Similar to myocarditis, would you expect certain symptomology for extended hypertension?
No, we generally consider hypertension or high blood pressure to be a silent killer for most people. It's just a very benign disease in terms of symptoms until it leads to heart attacks, strokes, or other serious complications.
Okay. You mentioned that your training includes the effects of drugs or pharmaceuticals on the heart.
Yes.
And you said you were aware of the drugs that were found in Michele's system at the time of her death.
Yes.
What drugs were those?
The ones that I understand are diazepam or Valium, Zolpidem or Ambien, promethazine or Phenergan, and oxycodone.
What effect, if any, in your opinion, would those drugs have on Michele MacNeill's heart?
Objection, Your Honor, found in relation to the amount of drugs that could possibly have an effect.
Overruled. He may answer.
You want me to ask that question again, or do you remember it?
I remember it.
Okay.
So of the 4 drugs mentioned, promethazine is the one that is known to cause QT prolongation or lengthen that time that it takes the heart to recharge.
Do these drugs or the narcotics, can they lengthen the QT interval?
That's somewhat more debatable from my understanding. Again, my specialty isn't toxicology, but on a recent review of the list of known QT prolonging drugs, I did not find oxycodone on that list.
Okay, what about, so which ones could elongate them?
Promethazine in particular, or Phenergan, the nausea medicine that she had been given.
And this would be dose dependent?
It is.
So the more you have, the more it would prolong that?
Typically, yes.
What about the Valium or the Zolpidem?
Again, to my knowledge and with a careful review recently of QT prolonging drugs, they are not felt to be significant prolongers.
How is your general opinion on this case affected by the pharmaceutical drugs found in her system at the time of her death?
I'm not trained in knowing what the different levels of the drugs mean, so I don't know that it affected me dramatically. I see it as I recognize that promethazine can have those results on a patient, but I don't know exactly what levels cause what complications. So.
Thank you.
You may cross.
Dr. Cragen, based upon the clinical symptoms that you've been able to identify from the records that you've reviewed, you didn't see anything that would have led you, if you were the treating physician of Michele, to refrain from prescribing promethazine?
Absolutely not.
Maybe my question wasn't right. I mean, just to make sure I was clear, you would have felt comfortable prescribing promethazine to Michele based upon the information that you were able to review?
Correct.
Right. And you wouldn't have thought that administering promethazine was likely to lead to an arrhythmia?
Not at typical appropriate doses and as it was ordered on the prescription that I saw.
As I understand your testimony from before, while 476 on the QT interval is a little higher and may have a bit of an increased risk, you wouldn't be particularly worried until it got to 500 on the QTC interval.
Correct.
Okay. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Anything else?
Oh, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, any questions for Dr. Cragen? Pass them to the end of the row. May Dr. Cragen be released from his trial subpoena?
I believe so.
No objection.
Thank you. You're released from your trial subpoena. You may step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next witness for the state.
State calls Dr. Perper.
Dr. Perper, if you'll come forward to the clerk's desk, please raise your right hand and be sworn.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you shall give in the case now pending before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do. Thank you. If you'll be seated here to my left and respond to counsel's questions.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Will you please state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Joshua A. purple. P like in Paul, E, R like in Robert, P like in Paul, E, R like in Robert.
And what is your profession, sir?
I'm a physician, and my specialty is pathology and forensic pathology.
Now, I notice you speak with an accent. Can you tell us where you come from originally?
I was born in Romania.
Okay. And how long have you been in the United States?
Since 1967.
Okay. Are you currently employed, Dr. Purper?
No, I am, until 2 years ago, I was the chief medical examiner for Broward County. This is the area of Fort Lauderdale. And now I am retired for about 2 years, since December 2011.
Okay.
And I am, however, practicing as a consultant medical legal expert, and also writing articles and books and giving occasional lectures.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your background as far as schooling and work experience and so forth. If you'll bear with me for just a few minutes. You indicate that you're a doctor. Where did you receive your schooling?
I have the following academic degrees. I have a medical degree from the Medical School of Hebrew University. I have a law degree from the Law School of Hebrew University. And I have a Master of Science in Forensic from Johns Hopkins University.
Can you describe what residencies you completed?
Yes, I have a residency of 4 years in Israel in pathology. I have 1 year of residence in pathology at the University of Maryland, and I have also 2 years of training and residency in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Baltimore, Maryland, starting from 1967.
You mentioned pathology. What is pathology?
Pathology is the branch of medicine which studies the causes and the changes produced by disease and injury in the human body. And forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology which is concerned with the analysis and investigation of sudden, unexpected, suspicious, or violent death, or death which appear natural and happen under unusual circumstances.
You indicated that you were the chief medical examiner for Broward County in Florida. Can you talk about your work experience going back from Broward County?
Right. From 1967 to 1972, I was an associate medical examiner and a research fellow at the Office of Chief Medical Examiner in Baltimore, Maryland. From 1972 to 1980, I was the chief forensic pathologist at the Office of the Coroner in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. That's the area of Pittsburgh. From 1980, except for a few months, I was the elected coroner of Allegheny County until 1994, when I moved to Florida, where I became the chief medical examiner for Broward County, this area of Fort Lauderdale, and I was so for 16 years until December 2011.
Have you, in your work history, had the opportunity to teach in a university setting?
Yes, I have different appointments. During my stay in Pittsburgh, I was a clinical professor of pathology at the University of Pittsburgh. I was also at that time a clinical professor of pathology and epidemiology at the University of Pittsburgh. And for a few years, I was an adjunct professor of law at Duquesne University. When I moved to Florida, I received similar academic appointment. I was a clinical professor of pathology at the University of Miami, Florida, and also clinical professor of epidemiology and public health at the University of Miami. And I had similar appointment at Nova Southeastern University.
Are you a member of any medical committees?
Yes, I'm a member of quite a number of numerous committees. I was in the past the chairman of the State Board of Pennsylvania, which is the board which supervises physician and penalizes physician. I was the chairman of the United Central Mental Health in Pennsylvania, and then I was also the chair of the section of pathology of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Okay. Do you have any certifications?
I am certified to practice medicine in the state of Florida, and I have inactive licenses in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C.
Have you, in your experience, ever received awards for your contribution in the
Yes, yes, I received different awards, including the Milton Helper Award of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences for contribution to forensic medicine in the United States.
Are you published?
Yes, I published about 10 books, or including both books and chapters and books. The 4 books which the primary 4 books which I wrote include the microscopic diagnosis in forensic pathology, the book When to Call the Doctor, and the book about when doctors steal, how and why, and under what circumstances. And there are some other books and publication which there are about 100 or 120.
Have you also published a book, or at least a chapter, with respect to the use of forensic pathology in defending criminal cases?
Yes, I did that.
And what was that book about?
This was a book in which basically this was an advice to attorney how should they properly address the defense of criminal cases in terms of producing of evidence and cross-examining as necessary.
Okay. You mentioned a number of other publications. Are some of those in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, probably more than 95 of my publication appeared in public reviews, professional review journals. This means that those journals were journals which were published, recognized medical journals, and in which publications submitted are reviewed by an editorial board which checks their reliability and precision.
Have you been published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences?
Yes, there are several publications, and there are different publications on pattern of injury, on homicides, on various numerous articles on suicides, articles on electrocution, drowning, a variety of forensic subjects.
Okay. All right, have you published in the American Journal of I'm not certain how to say the word, but...
Epidemiology.
There you go.
Okay. Yes, I did. Those publications which refer to what a lot of them were about arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, death due to heart disease primarily.
Okay. What about the Journal of American Medical Association? Are you published?
Yes, I published a number of publications in the Journal of American Association, including article about drug overdoses, and especially a drug which is called fentanyl or China white.
Have you participated in any special presentations?
Yes, I teach both at the University of Miami and during my stay in Pennsylvania at the University of Pennsylvania before students, before variety attorneys, police officers, general public, so a large variety of audiences.
Okay. Lastly, I just wanted to ask you about doctoral committees. Have you participated?
Yes, I sat on a number of doctoral committees which awarded degrees in primarily in public health to, I forgot the number, but there were 5 or 6 or 7 such postgraduate students which received their doctorate, their PhD.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Can you just briefly describe, and is it correct that you were in the court yesterday and listened to the testimony of Dr. Todd Gray?
Yes.
Okay. Will you briefly describe for the jury the role of a medical examiner?
The role of a medical examiner is defined in almost all United States by statute. And with some differences, the function are in the investigation of sudden, unexpected, suspicious or violent death. Sometimes those deaths are listed like being death of infants or death of drowning or death on vessels in United States water. And the responsibility of the medical examiner is to make a determination of the cause of death being the medical reason for the death of an individual. And they also have the obligation of making a determination of the manner of death, which is basically the circumstantial modality of death, whether the individual died of natural causes, whether he died of suicide, whether he died of a homicide, or whether he died of undetermined causes based on the evidence available to the medical examiner. Very rarely the medical examiner are able to go even beyond that and identify the specific defendant when certain evidence is very tightly attached to the defendant and no other person could have committed the violation of law or the crime.
When speaking of an undetermined death, when someone dies, it's either due to natural causes, an accident, suicide, or homicide, correct?
Correct.
If you can't determine one of those, it becomes undetermined.
That's correct.
But by nature of someone dying, it's necessarily one of those 4.
Yes, those are the only possibility, basically, yes.
Okay. So an undetermined death, it has to be one of those 4.
That's correct. Undetermined death basically occurs when the medical examiner doesn't have the capability either to expend his investigation. Obviously, the medical examiner is relying on the investigation of law enforcement agency, which submit this evidence to him, and his obligation is to examine critically this evidence for its reliability and precision.
You've touched on this just briefly, but what limitations does a medical examiner face when determining the manner of someone's death?
Well, the medical examiner is limited sometimes in his investigation because he doesn't have the authority to do that. In some cases, such as in Pennsylvania, when I was both the medical examiner and the coroner, basically, they were preliminary hearing whether to hold an individual for trial. So I sat in this capacity basically as a quasi-judge to determine whether the individual can be held for trial, and then I had the ability to question possible defendants. But usually in Florida, I did not have this capacity, and therefore, even if I would have wanted to to examine directly a defendant, I could not have done that because in this case he would not have been, the state would not have been able to institute any kind of further prosecution against him. So it depends on the state. So there are limitations to what the medical examiner can investigate. And as I said, he relies both of his investigators, which I had both in Pittsburgh and in Florida, and also rely on the information which is provided by law enforcement agency. And it's his duty to look with a critical eye at this evidence and determine its reliability and significance for the determination of the cause and manner of death.
Okay. If I were to propose a hypothetical to you, if we were walking along and we found an individual deceased at the bottom of a stairway, what kind of challenges does that present to you as a medical examiner?
Well, the first question would be why the individual died. If the individual doesn't have any kind of physical injury or has insignificant physical injury and has evidence of natural disease, then obviously this is the reason, would be the most likely reason for his death. However, even in those cases, we will do what is called toxicological determination to find out whether he was not intoxicated by alcohol or by drugs, and therefore his death was due to drugs or alcohol. If we found evidence of trauma, let's say we found a fractured neck as a result of the fall, then the question would be, what is the cause of death would be obvious in the absence of any other disease, and the determination would have to take in consideration whether the manner of death was an accident, in other words, whether he slipped on the steps and fell down, whether it was an homicide because somebody pushed the person intentionally over the steps, or if it was a suicide, whether he jumped on purpose in order to die. And in addition to that, obviously, we would look if he has any natural disease, such as a heart attack, which could have been substantiated by examination of the heart, to find whether a heart disease and a so-called heart attack did not precipitate the fall. So the fact that we know the cause of death and we know the place of death cannot by itself determine or guide us toward the determination of the manner of death, and the investigation has to be expanded accordingly.
Okay. Are you familiar with the case involving the decedent Michele MacNeill?
Yes, I am.
And she died on April 11th, 2007.
Yes, I am.
Were you asked to review an investigation and certain autopsy reports to render some opinions in this case?
Yes, sometimes I believe in late October and or November 2011, I was asked whether I'm ready to perform an evaluation of the case and express an opinion about the cause and manner of death. And I said that I'm ready to do that, and as a result of that, I was sent quite a lot of documentation, and also I asked to review the autopsy report and to look at the microscopic slides of tissue section which were taken during the autopsy of Michele MacNeill.
What's the purpose of looking at the autopsy slides? What does that help you to do?
Well, the purpose of looking at the autopsy slides is to see whether the tissue section present in the slides show any kind of natural disease or injury which can be helpful in assisting in determining what was the cause of death and sometimes the manner of death, in conjunction with all the other elements, including the autopsy findings, which were done by examining the body through the naked eye, and again by the circumstantial evidence, which I explained before, is very important in determining the manner of death.
What slides from what tissue samples did you look at?
The slides of the tissue samples were slides of the heart, slides of the lung, slides of the kidney, and slides of the liver.
Did you find those slides to be helpful in your determination?
Yes.
Okay. And were these the same slides that were looked at by Dr. Fricke and Dr. Gray in relationship to this case?
This is my understanding.
Okay. Did you also have the opportunity to review toxicology reports?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Have you also had occasion to look at some blood lab results from the decedent, Michele MacNeill?
Yes, I also had the opportunity of looking of blood, both what we call hemogram, in other words, analysis of the blood in terms of elements of the blood presence, and also chemistry of the blood. And some of them were from 2003 when Michele was hospitalized, and also which were taken at the time when she was brought to the hospital. Also in this particular case, it was interesting because about 8 days prior to her death, she had a plastic operation, and prior to the operation, as part of the surgical preparation, there were blood tests taken both in terms of the hemogram, which I explained what it was, and in terms of the blood chemistry to verify that surgery can be performed.
Did you find those lab results helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Perper, did you ultimately form an opinion after reviewing all of these materials as to Michele MacNeill's cause of death?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
My opinion was that Michele died as a result of drowning, and in addition to that, she had some drugs on board which were not in toxic or lethal levels, but in my opinion could have contributed to her death.
Are you aware of the opinion from Dr. Fricke, the doctor that performed the autopsy?
Yes.
She indicated that Michele appeared to have died of heart disease, myocarditis and hypertension.
Yes.
Are you also familiar with Dr. Gray's addendum to the case?
Yes.
He indicated Michele died of heart disease, the myocarditis and hypertension, combined with drug toxicity.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to the diagnosis of myocarditis?
Yes. I looked very carefully at the slides of the heart of this individual, and there were 4 such sections. In other words, what we looked is that the pathologist who is doing the autopsy takes actual sections from the tissue of the heart. Those sections are then prepared in a special way. The water is taken out by dehydrating the specimen. The specimen is then specially prepared, placed in blocks of paraffin, and then cut in very, very sliced, very thin section. So those sections then can be stained in order to demonstrate the differences between the different components of the cells which form the tissue. And the cells have as a nucleus, as you all know, and this is stained with a stain which has an affinity for the nucleus, which is acid, and therefore it stains in blue. And the cytoplasm, this is the environment in which the nucleus in the cell is present, is stained by a stain which is called eosin, and stains the cytoplasm in pink. Various different proteins of protoplasm are stained in pink, and therefore, after staining those things, the very thin slices of tissue are placed on a glass, and they are covered with the cover glass, and then they are examined under the microscope. So they are basically fixed. This is tissue which has been previously fixed in formalin to stabilize the chemical bonds in the tissue and to prepare it for cutting, embedding in paraffin, and sectioning and putting it on the slide. And those are the slides of the tissue which I examined, as I said, from the heart and other tissues.
Okay. Have just a moment, Your Honor.
You may.
Dr. Perper, I'm handing you 3 documents that we'll use for demonstrative purposes today. Do you recognize those?
Yes, I do.
And what are those?
Those are photographs, or rather microphotographs, which were taken from section areas of section of the heart, which were examined by me under the microscope. And the microscope is connected to a camera, which is a Leica camera. And this camera takes photographs at different magnification according to the magnification which are set to me under the microscope when I look at those slides. So those are photographs taken of lung tissue at different magnification, because just by looking at the heart, it looks very much like any kind of muscle, because the heart is a muscle.
On the bottom left, it identifies a number.
Yes.
And we're looking at number 1. First of all, Dr. Perper, when you are looking for evidence of myocarditis, you mentioned a stain that's used, but what are you looking for when you examine the slides and the tissues to identify myocarditis?
Well, when I examine the tissue for myocarditis, it's obviously my obligation to look at the heart section. I looked at the heart section under different magnification. Under sufficient magnification, it's possible to identify the cells which form the heart, which we call them the myocardial fibers. Those myocardial fibers have a nucleus, which is stained, as I told you. They have cytoplasm, which is stained, as I told you. And therefore, I have to look at the appearance of the myocardial fibers first. If they look normal, they may look enlarged, or they may look smaller, or they may have other abnormality. Second, I have to look, if I want to make a determination of myocarditis, whether there is any cellular infiltrate between the myocardial fibers. In other words, whether they are inflammatory cells, cells which appear when there is an inflammation of the body. And those cells can be seen between the myocardial fibers, and they affect adversely the myocardial fibers because they can be damaged or totally destroyed, or what we call necrotic. Those inflammatory cells can be acute inflammatory cells, and this is happening sometimes of myocarditis, usually when the myocarditis is a result of an infection by an organism, or they may be chronic inflammatory cells. Those are usually lymphocyte cells which are round and stain very blue with the special stain. And those are seen in the type of myocarditis which is called by a virus. So they are called viral myocarditis or chronic myocarditis. The essential criteria for the determination of myocarditis is the presence of this infiltrate of cells. In other words, it's like having, you can look at the myocardium as being of bricks, except that the bricks are elongated, they are fibers. So regular between bricks, you may see very little or nothing. In the case of myocarditis, between those bricks of myocardial fibers, you see those round cells will infiltrate them, and they can be of different profusion in this location. So if I see infiltrating cells between myocardial fibers of the type which I described to you, then I can make a determination of myocarditis. Now, this can be mild myocarditis if there are very few cells. It may be moderate myocarditis if there are moderate numbers of cells, or it may be severe myocarditis if there are a wide profusion of cells. And again, the cells will be affected, as I said before, damaged by this inflammatory infiltrate.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm going to direct your attention to the first photograph there.
The photograph, at the bottom of the photograph, there are two things. Number one, the thing which says MacNeill to indicate that this was taken from Michele MacNeill. And on the other side, there is a number, which is basically the serial number of the autopsy from which this autopsy, from which those sections were taken. It's 07-574-3. And then there is the magnification. In other words, it says in this particular one, the first one, it says X25, which says magnification times 25 times the initial size of the section.
Okay. Would it be helpful for you in your testimony to have this photograph up on the big screen? You can describe what you see and what you don't see to the jury?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. We'll turn to the first slide.
Have you moved for its admission, counsel?
I would. Judge, if I can approach, I'll mark these.
If you would.
I can take all three.
Doctor, I'm directing your attention to number 52.
Are you moving for the admission of these before we put them on the screen?
And I move to admit 52, 53, and 54, Your Honor.
Any objection from the defense?
No objection, Your Honor.
States 52, 53, and 54 are received.
Thank you. Doctor, I have a laser pointer here that may help you direct the jury to what you're looking at here.
Yes.
If you need to come down and approach, you can.
That's fine, I can do it for okay. What you have here is an image of the heart muscle at 25 magnification. At this time, what you see those basically masses of pinkish tissue, which are the muscle fiber. And here you see an area which is about 1/4 of a millimeter, which you basically on the naked eye you wouldn't see it. A millimeter is about 1/16 of an inch. So this would be about 1/4 of a 1/15 of an inch. And if you look carefully at it, you see that there is here some kind of whitish discoloration. It's really not, this magnification is not terribly clear, but I wanted to show you the entire section. This is a scar. This we call it a focal scar. And when we see multiple scars like that, and there were several scars throughout the myocardium, we call this focal myocardial fibrosis. Fibrosis means scarring. It's the same thing as saying focal myocardial scarring. Okay? The muscle here, basically the heart muscle, is like a mesh, like a network of fibers which act in unison. They call it a syncytium. So the entire heart muscle can contract and relax at the same time. That's the first slide.
Let me turn to, I believe it's Exhibit 53, the second slide. What are we looking at there, Doctor?
We looked at a similar appearance of the slide. This time, the magnification is times 50. So it's a double magnification of the previous one. Here you see, again, the myocardial fibers. And here you see much more clearly this area of whitish tissue in which you cannot see at this magnification. Maybe you can see also here some reddish area inside the white area. Those are fibers of the heart which are entrapped in this area of scarring. So basically it's the same focal scarring, except here at the higher magnification you get a better view both of the scarring and that it contains some entrapped muscle fiber.
With respect to myocarditis, can you explain what
Now, if this would be myocarditis, then here between the fibers here, which here you see much clearly their appearance that they are elongated in fibers, you would see like blue dots, multiple blue dots of the inflammatory cells. And this would be the mark of myocarditis.
do you see on this slide multiple blue dots, Doctor?
No, there is no infiltration of cell, but what you have, you can see the scars. Definitely the focal myocardial scarring, but there is no infiltration of inflammatory cells, whether acute or of the type which you see in viral myocarditis.
Dr. Perper, as I look at this slide, I do see some darker discoloration. What is that?
Well, those white discoloration, I don't know which, I think that you can see even the nuclei, and I don't know if you have a, I think you have a better one. Yeah, those are the nuclei which you are going to see better inside each one of those fibers, which here you don't see them at higher magnification, so it's more difficult to see the nuclei inside. Each one has a nucleus in the center of the cell, and this is what it makes it a heart muscle cell. Usually muscle from the arms, what we call peripheral muscle, don't have the nuclei in the center, that they have them at the periphery, as you are going to see in the next slide.
Turning to Exhibit 54. Right. What are we looking at on this slide here, Dr.
This slide is done at much higher magnification at 200. And in this slide, you already can see both the muscle fibers and you can see the nuclei inside the muscle fiber. And again, you see some space a little bit between the muscle fibers, but there are no acute inflammatory cells of any significance here. So there is no myocarditis in those areas which I showed you.
Thank you. You can get the lights, Cal. Your opinion then, Doctor, with respect to myocarditis is what?
My opinion is that after I reviewed very carefully and thoroughly those slides, I did not find any evidence of myocarditis.
Are you able to explain, is it possible to misdiagnose myocarditis? Is it possible to see something on those slides that appeared to be myocarditis, but it just wasn't? What explanation would you have for that?
By definition, you can see myocarditis. If you don't see myocarditis, then there's no myocarditis. Myocarditis is a problem to diagnose clinically because sometimes clinically myocarditis can be totally asymptomatic, and the person might die with myocarditis and there may be no clinical information. But the pathologist who looks at the heart section would find myocarditis. So yes, clinically myocarditis is difficult to diagnose. It's very easily to miss, and even electrocardiogram is not going to show evidence of myocarditis. But the pathology must and does show it.
Okay. You indicate that the cause of death is drowning.
Correct.
And let's just talk a little bit about that. What is the basis for you to come to the conclusion that Michele MacNeill drowned?
Well, the fact that an individual is found in water is not necessarily an indication of drowning, because drowning, water can enter the air spaces after the individual is in water for a long time. The individual may die of heart disease, and the body may drop in the water, or the body may be thrown in the water after death. Or the person may die of a drug overdose, and somebody may throw the body in the water afterward. However, what we learn about drowning is that it's in a process in which the death is not just due to the fact that water obstructs the airway. In other words, that the person chokes on water. What we found out, and now nobody basically denies it, that one of the mechanisms of drowning is the fact that the person, both after a period when it's dropped in water, initially he obviously doesn't want to inhale water, but then because he feels the need to breathe, eventually he is both inhaling water and swallowing water, and swallowing significant amounts of water. The water which goes into the airway reaches the lungs and reaches the chambers of the lungs, and the chambers of the lungs are lined by very thin wall which contain very thin blood vessel, and the blood vessel, the blood in the blood vessel basically absorb the water. So large amounts of water are absorbed in the body, in the lung, and as a result of this large absorption of water, the vital chemical, what we call electrolyte, which are present in the blood, are diluted. And the person, in addition to the fact that he doesn't have the ability to breathe, he has this tremendous dilution by the water which is inhaled, enters the lung, and is absorbed in the blood. This dilution of the essential chemical in the blood can be fatal because the blood and the body system is such structured that it needs a certain level of chemical in order to sustain life, and if this chemical are diluted or are increased, the person dies. So therefore, in drowning, you have to have this dilution of water. People die sometimes coming out of the water and still being aware, and then they collapse and they need medical treatment. Some die, some don't, and we call that near drowning. And the pathology in the near drowning is done because of this absorption of water. So in this particular case of Michele, there were certain findings which we don't see in many drownings and are very helpful in determining the determination of drowning, which by no means is usually an easy determination. Number one, these reports, there are reports of the people who did the resuscitation, that she basically, when her chest was compressed in the resuscitation process, she regurgitated large amounts of water, which my understanding is that from the testimony which I witnessed, which I saw on TV, was about 4 cups of water from one occasion and about 3 cups of water on the other occasion, which is about 2 liters of water, close to 2 liters, and water and 3/4, which is about half a gallon of water. That's a lot of water. In addition to that, when she was brought to the hospital, they drained the airway, and additional water, which was partly bloody and partly foamy, came out. So it was clear that she was inhaling a significant amount of water. Now, usually in drowning...
Doc, can I stop you for just a moment? Is there a significance with the discolored, foamy substance that came from her? What does that mean?
Well, it means that the water was mixed with some protein which came out from the blood because the thing was partly bloody. And like if you take a white of an egg and you beat it with water, it becomes foamy. The same thing happens if you get some protein and some mucus in the airway and it's mixed with water.
Okay.
Now, usually this is a very unusual circumstances because in this case we have data of the blood from 2003. We have data from the blood 8 days before the drowning, and we have data at the hospital when she arrived. So we have a situation which we don't have in most cases.
I'm sorry. Stop for just a second. You may. Our morning recess at this time. Please keep in mind my admonition to you. Don't discuss any subject of the trial amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express any opinion about the case until it's finally submitted to you for deliberation. Avoid television, radio, and internet news coverage of the trial. And finally, do no research on your own using a computer, iPhone, or something else. Court's in recess.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. You may step down, Dr. Perker. Thank you. You may. Yeah, restrooms are outside the door if you need them. We are now outside the presence of the jury, but remain on the record. We've had a fairly extensive bench conference. I'd like you to, Mr. Spencer, state your objection on the record again.
Your Honor, it appears that Dr. Perper has done some extensive additional research on the case and analysis that has not been fairly disclosed to the defense.
Specifically, what is that?
Specifically in relation to opinions that he seems to be prepared to give in comparing lab tests from 2003 as well as lab tests from 2007, shortly before the plastic surgery that were done on March 29.
And then the last one post-death, correct?
The last one post-death. And there has not been fair notice of that.
These are blood tests, correct?
Blood tests, yes. At the preliminary hearing, well, first of all, there's nothing mentioned in his report about his evaluation of lab tests as having anything to do with his determination of drowning as a cause of death. Second, at the preliminary hearing on direct exam, he didn't bring up, to my recollection, anything about lab tests in support of his determination of the cause of death. During cross-examination, I asked him a number of questions about comparing the March 29, 2007 labs and the April 11, 2007 labs for the purpose of ascertaining if changes were consistent with hepatitis or not. He responded to a number of those questions and said that no, it's not consistent with hepatitis, it's consistent with dilution, he said. And I'll find the site here in a minute, but it's my recollection that we then got to the point that I asked him about drowning and what lab results he felt were consistent with a dilution that would be indicative of drowning, and he said sodium was the only one that he felt was consistent with drowning, is my recollection.
In the blood testing?
In the blood testing, yes. And now it seems that he has got lots of other thoughts on that, and none of which has been disclosed to me. The state says that he's been made available to me. Well, he was made available to me when I was given notice that he was made available was after I submitted my expert reports. And so he was made available for me to talk with him in relation to rebuttal of my experts, of which I was told he had some rebuttal. I did call and talk to him about that, and we probably spoke for 20, 30 minutes, almost all of which time was spent in him sharing his beliefs as to why the expert reports that I submitted were not accurate in this way or that.
Did any of that conversation relate to blood value comparisons?
No, not to my recollection, with the exception of hepatitis, and that we again discussed his opinion that my expert, Dr. Lee's opinions in relation to hepatitis, he said were wrong. I don't recall, even in relation to that, I don't recall any discussion in relation to the lab values. His primary argument was that the liver did not show any signs of necrosis in the slide the one slide that we have of the liver, and therefore Dr. Lee's opinion that Michele was beginning to show signs of anesthesia-induced hepatitis was wrong. And he had very strong opinions about that, and that was the largest part of our conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Would you, Mr. Grunander, just was there anything else? Any other objection?
We had additional discussion about Dr. Melanick's report, and his Dr. Melanick's report, as far as the cause of death, is very similar to his. And so then we had discussion about his disagreement with Dr. Melanick in determining the death to be an accident when she should have made it undetermined like him. And so that was another good chunk of our conversation.
Okay.
Discussing things that he appears to be going into today, I don't recall that being part of our conversation at all, and it's not something that was in my reports that he would have been rebutting, and it's not something that I was given notice of to inquire about.
Thank you. Would you make a proffer as to what Dr. Perper will say in relation to these blood comparisons?
I believe he's going to talk about how there wasn't anything significant as far as dilution and levels in the previous reports leading up to, and then on the day in question, April 11, 2007, he does see some dilution. And he can talk about, for example, the sodium may not be as diluted as he would think it would be because she was administered bicarbonate by EMTs and at the ER as well. There might be some discussion with respect to calcium on that issue as well.
What I'd like to do is make sure that I have a clear proffer of what he's going to say for the record in the event that any of it's excluded, so that we have a record of that. Do you need to speak with him to make a complete proffer?
A little bit more on some of the details.
Okay, why don't you have him in? Why don't you, we could just put him on. Let's hear what he has to say. Dr. Perper, would you retake the witness stand, please? By way of explanation, the defense has objected to certain parts of your testimony, and I need to make a decision about that. Mr. Grunander, outside the presence of the jury, is going to ask you questions, and that way I can understand your answers, and then I'll make a decision about that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Perper, you've referred to some lab results that were taken from blood samples from different periods of time.
Yes.
What are those? What's the timing of the results we're talking about today?
There are two types of blood results. The blood results of what I said are the hemogram. Those are the counts of the number of red blood cells, the hemoglobin, and other elements of blood. And those were from 3 periods of times. From January the 22nd, 2003, this is
Yes.
at that time. Then from March 30, 2007, this is the time when the blood tests were taken prior to her plastic surgery. And the third one is from 4/11/2007. Those are the blood tests of the hemogram which were taken at the time when Michele MacNeill was brought to the hospital. The second set is basically a set of similar dates of the blood chemistry, which included the test of sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, protein, albumin, and alkaline phosphatase. But that's important. But basically the one which I mentioned.
With respect,
Same dates again?
I'm sorry?
Different test, same dates. Is
Those
that
are the
right?
same test from 3 different dates.
Okay,
So therefore, they are comparable.
okay. Go ahead.
with respect, you were about to testify about the dilution or the lack of dilution. You were going to make some comparisons.
What my testimony is going to show is that, number one, remember there are 2 sets of tests, one from 2003 and sets from 2007. What I'm saying is that the times from 2003 and the times from March 30, 2007, they are congruent. Basically, they are stable. There are no changes. There are no significant changes before that. So in this period of time, there was no variation, neither in the composition of the blood nor in the chemical composition of various other elements in the blood. And then this is like the baseline. And then we have the test which were done at the time when she was brought to the hospital. And therefore, those tests show what was the change. In most of those elements was a decline. In some elements, it was an increase, which has an explanation because of the treatment. And we know that she received about 20% increase in her blood, and therefore, if there would have been a 20% dilution of the blood by the therapeutic amounts of fluid which she received, there would have been a corresponding decrease in the various chemical and components of the blood. This decrease should have been theoretically by 20%. In fact, mathematically it's by 17%, but for calculation purposes, there is no difference between 17% and 20%. So you can say she received 20% of blood, there therefore should be a decrease of 20% of the various components of the blood. However, the data from the time when she was brought to the hospital indicates that for many of those components, the decline was not 20% or as expected, but it was 33%, 50% or more than that. So this indicates clearly that the decline is not just due by the fluids which she was given therapeutically, but by the water which she inhaled. And then there are additional things which apply to the presence of the lungs, which were heavy. The report of the medical examiner said that the lungs were well aerated. And this is a statement.
Is this something different, the weight of the lungs?
That's a different story.
No,
So I'm going to
the weight of
stop
the
here.
lungs was discussed at the preliminary hearing.
Yeah, but your objection doesn't go to weight of the lungs, correct? Just goes to the blood testing.
Okay.
Is there anything further
I
on the
think
record for
that's a fair
blood testing?
explanation, I think, of the expected testimony on the lab and blood results.
Okay. Do you have any preliminary hearing transcript sections I can look at?
Yes, Your Honor, on page 1476 and page 1460. And let's see. Page 1451, 52. The other issue, Your Honor, if I may, in light of the proffer,
Go ahead.
is it's not just that it wasn't disclosed, is that his testimony is not generally accepted in the scientific community. When the person dies, even as he testified at the preliminary hearing, a process of hemolysis occurs. And with hemolysis, then the potassium typically increases in the blood, sodium would decrease. There's no way that he can possibly tell what percentage of these changes in electrolytes is due to hemolysis and what percentage is due to the possible ingestion of water. Furthermore, the scientific literature is quite clear that in almost all cases when people drown, it's not a large amount of water that is ingested. It's typically a small amount.
Preliminary hearing,
I'm sorry, Judge.
any pages of the preliminary hearing transcript you would like me to look at?
1455, if that wasn't already discussed,
Okay.
talks about the dilution of blood and the chemicals in the blood which is absorbed from the lungs. I'll try and find a few more right here, Your Honor.
Okay.
I would just like to make a brief record
Go ahead.
with respect to the law here, Your Honor.
The other thing I'd like to see is his written report. Do you have a copy of that?
I do. May I approach?
You may.
Let me get a pristine copy, Your Honor.
Okay. For the record, Mr. Spencer, is this the report that you were provided?
I'm sure it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. I'll hear you as to the law.
The notice statute, Your Honor, is found in Section 7717-13. I'll first start with subsection 5A. It reads, for purposes of this section, testimony of an expert at a preliminary hearing held pursuant to Rule 7 constitutes notice of the expert, his qualifications, and a report of the expert's proposed trial testimony as to the subject matter testified to by the expert at the preliminary hearing.
Yeah.
Moving up, had there not been a preliminary hearing held here, the state's required to provide a copy of the expert's report, which we have nonetheless. Rather than a report, a written explanation can be provided as well. There's been no need because of the report and the testimony here. Also notice that the expert's available to cooperatively consult with the opposing counsel on reasonable notice. That was given, as I recall, back in about February or so initially, and then there was an additional notice that was provided in about August, I believe, Randy?
I don't think that's when you gave me notice that I could
Yes.
add information to rebut.
Upon receiving the defense experts' reports. And I would indicate as well in Dr. Lee's report, there are tables with labs talking about different chemicals in the body and the reactions of Michele in this matter here. And that's in Dr. Lee's report that was provided to Dr. Perper. Mr. Spencer was certainly given notice that he could consult with Dr. Perper with respect to that.
Is this, just want to be clear, so is it your position that what I've just heard is rebuttal testimony to Dr. Lee? Should we be waiting to hear this until Dr. Lee testifies?
Not necessarily, because I think it goes directly to what he's testified about drowning and the effects on Michele's body. Just because you didn't go through each and every chemical at the preliminary hearing does not mean notice hasn't been required. That would require us to have an evidentiary hearing, just like we're doing now in front of a jury, in order for notice to be provided. So,
Okay.
just 1 second. So there was certainly discussion at the preliminary hearing of dilution of chemicals in the body, as that would relate to drowning.
In the blood, you mean, right?
Yes,
Okay.
in the blood. I would also indicate here that in 4A it says that if the defendant or the prosecution fails to substantially comply with the requirements, the opposing party shall, if necessary to prevent substantial prejudice, again, substantial prejudice, be entitled to a continuance of the trial or hearing sufficient to allow preparation to meet the testimony. I'm also prepared to give the court another citation to the preliminary hearing.
Go ahead.
He needs to read all the pages from 450.
It's page 455. excuse me,
1459
1459,
to
and it goes on for several
1460.
pages, at which point Judge McVeigh actually cut off the questioning because he did not want to have to go through all of this at the preliminary hearing,
Okay.
as it was essentially just discovery.
1459 through 65,
No, 1460.
60.
Just one page?
I'm sorry, 1455 through 1460.
Okay, 1455 through 1460, Your Honor.
Good.
I think that suffices.
Thank you. Anything else from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor, I don't dispute the law, but the law needs to be applied fairly. And at the preliminary hearing, I endeavored to make sure I understood what his testimony was going to be, and I think that that's abundantly clear on page 1476. And so I asked him the question, okay, all I'm asking you to do right now is point out any values that you believe are consistent with dilution. His answer was, there are no value except for the value of which I discussed of sodium. However, as I said before, this is not the initial stream. This is the stream after treatment. Question, so did I understand your testimony right, that only sodium on defendant's exhibit number 1, which was the lab value from American Fork Hospital on April 11, 2007. So I said, so did I understand your testimony right, that only sodium on defendant's exhibit number 1 is consistent with, and he interrupts and says, right. I finished with dilution, and he says, right. Because here the calcium is elevated at 12.385, when initially it was 2.4 after death, yes. And so on defendant's exhibit number, so then I go on, question. And so on defendant's exhibit number 1, only sodium manifests dilution. Answer, yes. Question. How was I supposed to be on notice from the preliminary hearing testimony that his opinions are apparently so different? I think that in light of the law, our objection should be sustained.
Thank you. Anything else?
Yes. This is a matter for impeachment, Your Honor. If counsel thinks he's changed his testimony or just simply adding to his testimony, he can be impeached on that issue. Notice has been provided, and the remedy to exclude and inhibit an important witness like this from being able to testify about his opinion that Michele MacNeill drowned would be completely inappropriate and unfair prejudice to the state. Notice has been satisfied.
Thank you. Court's in recess.
All rise.